Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the TD Bank Morning Star Speaker Series. My name is Jack McDougall, and I am the President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. As you probably know, the Board of Trade continues to provide a valuable forum to discuss critical issues for our region and our members. And the TD Bank Morning Star Speaker Series is one of our favorites because it brings exciting new ideas from world-class authors and thought leaders. This speaker series is made possible by TD Bank, and they have sponsored this event from its very beginning, starting more than 10 years ago, and we've had a great run ever since. TD Bank is one of the 10 largest banks in the United States, with 26,000 employees and deep roots in the community dating back more than 150 years, even deeper than the Board of Trade, which dates back 130 years. TD Bank offers a variety of retail, small business, and commercial banking services to more than 8.5 million customers through its extensive network in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, the Carolinas, and Florida. TD Bank has 55 locations here in the Greater Washington area, and they keep growing every day. It's now a privilege to turn things over to Terry Kenny. Terry is TD Bank's Market President for the Metro DC, Baltimore, and Delaware region. And perhaps most importantly, he is a good friend and a long-standing member of the Board of Trade. Terry, we can't thank you enough for your commitment and support. It allows us to introduce interesting folks like Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts to our members at a time when bold ideas are needed more than ever. Terry, thank you so much, and thanks to TD Bank.
Hey, Jack, thank you, and I do appreciate it, and the friendship is definitely sincere between TD Bank, myself, and the Board of Trade, and we are very proud to continue our sponsorship of these Morning Star sessions. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts. She is an author, educator, researcher, and consultant who helps leaders cultivate their strengths and achieve extraordinary performance and personal fulfillment. Laura is currently a professor of practice at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. Her book, Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience, is a rare and important compilation of essays that examines how race matters in people's experience of work and leadership. What does it mean to be Black in corporate America today? How are racial dynamics in organizations changing? How do we build inclusive organizations? This groundbreaking book shines new light on these and other timely questions, and it illuminates the present-day dynamics of race in the workplace. I know I don't need to tell all the folks on the phone today how important it is that we understand the experiences of Black Americans and work hard to make our organizations much more inclusive. This year has challenged all of us to do that work, and I know many of you are stepping up. This morning, Laura will share some insight that will help us to be successful in that effort. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Roberts, and I will now turn it over to Laura.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Terry, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the DC Board of Trade and to Hooks Books for inviting me to engage with you in this conversation today. Our topic of discussion is race, work, and leadership, new perspectives on the Black experience. And this work comes from our series of conversations that began long before 2020, though we will talk about some of the hot topics in 2020 and how we can make the most of the moment in which we find ourselves to have more of these bold conversations that can bring forth bold ideas that can help us to shape a world in which we truly value difference. And in this vein of valuing difference, I have been quite fortunate to benefit from the scholarship and the collaboration in thought leadership and practice of over 75 scholars. They've helped to contribute to 2 edited volumes that I've been pleased to publish. Most recently is Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience, but also published several years ago, about 7 years ago, a book called Positive Organizing in a Global Society. And I emphasize both because as we think about current conversations around race, work, and leadership, it's important that we anchor on the potential for positive organizing. How can we understand and value our differences so that we can work together in more effective and impactful ways that can truly help us to co-create a better world? I use a quote unquote positive lens, and I'm not alone in using this positive lens to understand work in organizations. Many of the other scholars and thought leaders who contributed to both edited volumes also take on this positive lens. We want to acknowledge the challenges, the difficulties, the hardship that many members of our organizations face. We want to be honest and accurate and candid about inequality and the ways in which it shows up and the adverse impact that it has on our organizations. But we also want to understand what's working well and to learn from what we call those pockets of goodness that are all around us so that we can grow, develop, and build from there. So it's not enough to just identify and talk about the problems, but we want to search for solutions and to continue to amplify and activate what we know works. And so much of what I'll share with you in our session today includes a statement of the problem and evidence that support kind of where we are and how we came to be in this current moment in summer of 2020. Moving now into fall of 2020, but also what we have learned over the years that has worked, that works well, and things that we can do differently, even starting today, to help us to build and grow. And in that vein, I anchor very heavily on the importance of identity and cultivating and sustaining positive identities at work. And this is going to be a key element of the discussion today because our identities truly are our greatest sources of strength. Most humans are hardwired to want to have a positive sense of self in the context of their work and to help other people to cultivate and sustain that positive sense of self, both within themselves and then also to affirm and validate others in those ways. When we cultivate these positive identities, they enable us to maximize human potential. One of the greatest travesties that exists in organizations that are diverse but not inclusive is that we are not maximizing our individual or our collective potential under those circumstances. So we have to reframe the ways that we think about ourselves and others in order to move in that direction. So we're going to start with a couple of polls. We have 3 poll questions. Thank you, Nadia. The first poll question, I have a list of categories that you can check. When you think about your positive identities, what 3 identities would fit in your list of positive identities, your top 3? And here are several options from which you can choose. Professional identity, family status, like husband or mother, your hometown or place of residence, could be New Yorker, Southerner, Washingtonian, your racial identity, your gender identity, your religious affiliation, your sexual orientation, your job title, occupation, or profession, your school alumni status, and then hobbies or involvement in social activities or social causes. So I hope you had a chance to answer that first question, pick 3 that resonate. A second polling question, second and third polling questions drill into race in particular, which I'll talk about, but always in the context of these broader identities as well, that we all hold and carry. Race is but one, but how often did you talk about race? Anything related to race, identity, categories, injustice, problems, inclusion, diversity, hiring initiatives, what have you. How often did you talk about race at work before June 2020, was it never, like you'd never come up before, maybe once or twice annually, just like once a year, about once every month? For those who say annually, it's maybe like at a special time, a Heritage Month or a History Month or something, or weekly, like it was a pretty frequent part of your work and conversations. And then has anything changed in that continuum post June 2020, like over the summer? I know annually is a little bit off, but I am interested to see if you would have any kind of shift pre-2020, post-2020 in the ways that you've engaged in race. I think we should have had enough time right now to get some responses on the poll. Can we see what those responses are? Can you display them? Oh, thank you very much. Okay, so what are some of the most popular identities here? We have the professional or the work-related identities, very strong sense of self here, 57% here. And then I went a little broader with job title, occupation, that's 45%. Very high. Your family status, husband, mother, strong source of identity for more than half of you. Then we start to move in some of the other social, socio-demographic identities. But look at how these three often hang together. So there's racial identity, there's also gender identity, and then there's their hometown, place of residence, which also feeds into our cultural background and sense of self and understanding. But we also have those who identify with religious affiliations. Your school alumni status, not as high. Sexual orientation, not very high in this group. But hobbies and involvements, about 1 in 4 of you also have non-work related investments and that help you to cultivate a more positive sense of self. What's going on with these race conversations? So for those of you who joined, about half of you had these conversations relatively frequently at work, even before summer 2020. But look what's been happening over summer 2020. For those who are with us today, close to 70% of you have been having conversations about race weekly. That's a huge jump. That tells us sort of where we are. And as we set this context, I'm going to invite us to think a little more about how the conversations have unfolded and ways in which they may have changed over even these past few months. So if we would appreciate a continuum of experiences, we could acknowledge that within a given society, there are a set of practices, beliefs, and structures that are put in place to ensure or legitimate inequality. And sometimes there can be a very, very small set of people, but those voices come out in very strong ways that oppose the kinds of inclusion, progress, and advancement that one might offer. They're actively protesting different forms of diversity, inclusion, equity, justice initiatives within organizations. But then there are also a number of people who, for reasons of choice or just a lack of exposure, just have not been tuned into conversations about race and about difference, and really think that the best place to start is by not seeing race at all. And if we're not going to see race, it will be colorblind, and we certainly don't want to talk about it. And so that underlies a lot of the silence within our workplaces in particular around race, particularly before we came to this moment in summer 2020. We have a number of organizations, and from what I could see in that brief data set, this probably refers to many of your organizations, where you have been engaging in some initiatives to be more proactive and intent in your attempts to include more people, create a sense of belonging and welcoming within the organization. But even as we reached summer of 2020, there were still a set of questions and critiques being raised about whether or not organizations and their leaders had truly gone far enough to counteract the structural inequality that was associated with race. So with the intentionally inclusive dynamic, we think about everybody being welcome and in seeing the differences, right? But bringing everybody to the table. When we get beyond, even beyond inclusion, to talk about some of the questions of equality and inequality, then we start to think about the question of race in a as it's associated with rank, with power, with privilege, with access to resources. So I think of the other word race as like a competition, right? Where there's a winner and then there are also losers, and race as a word has that meaning as well. So in general, I think about what's been happening for individuals and societies along this continuum is one of tuning in to race in different ways. Now, hearing race as if it were a station on an XM radio channel where there are many people who were kind of born tuned in to these conversations about race. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. At the time in which I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which incidentally is also the hometown of Michael Jackson and all of his family and siblings. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, third, fourth generation. And my great grandfather was the principal of a very distinguished high school in Gary, Indiana for 30 years, Gary Roosevelt High School. So I had that source of pride. My father and grandfather were community leaders in Gary, Indiana as well. My father as a physician in Gary, Indiana, which provided us with a lot of opportunities. But in the same token, at the time in which I grew up in Gary, Indiana, there was also structural inequality because Northwest Indiana, where Gary is nestled right outside of Chicago, in the 1980s was the most segregated region of the United States. So there was the hyper segregation that we still see in a lot of urban areas, which also correlates with race and class. So race is complex, it's structural, it's not just about finding the individuals who are perpetrating, bad actions. It's about really understanding a system of reinforcing patterns and beliefs and behaviors that can exacerbate or minimize equality. It's important for us to think about all forms of diversity and the value that they bring into our organizations. And when we tune in to those differences, they jolt us into cognitive action in ways that, as Catherine Phillips wrote, homogeneity simply does not. So the benefits of diversity include helping us to think in more sophisticated and nuanced ways, helping us to challenge our assumptions, being more resourceful, creative, innovative. We anticipate alternate solutions to problems, so we're better able to solve different and complex problems. We're more aware of what the market needs are and the market opportunities may be. We become more attractive in terms of bringing the best talent into our organizations. So there is a strong business case for helping us to leverage differences, including racial differences in our organizations. But there's also a moral case that has been a key part of the conversation. The business case talks about inclusion because it helps us to promote creativity, decision-making, and market access, as I mentioned before, but it also involves having to make some sacrifices or some tough choices about our resources and our priorities. But also, even moving beyond that, there's a moral case, and the moral case may be even stronger and more enduring than the business case. When we're talking about who we want to be as organizations, as leaders, as societies, and our stance on equity, dignity, and justice within the organizations and within our societies. How do we acknowledge and recognize the harm that has been done? What steps can we take to restore that harm? So valuing difference requires us to do some work, in order to get a return on the investment or help people to maximize their potential at work. It also requires us to do some work in terms of searching our head, our heart, our hands. 3 zones of action I'll talk about to help us to bring forth more equity, dignity, and justice. let me share with you some of the data that I'm using to support those recommendations about the way forward. And then I'll provide you with some more specific steps that organizations and leaders are taking in order to help us to truly value difference. Um, Insights from the Black experience, as featured in Race, Work, and Leadership, are vast. And so I'm going to just take a few minutes to highlight 4 key themes. And the themes align with 4 prominent initiatives that organizations engage in around diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. So the first is the conversation about access, which often comes up when we talk about representation and the pipeline. The second is a conversation around authenticity, which is incorporated in work on inclusion, organizational culture change, enhancing a sense of belonging. The third important conversation is one around advancement. And this is when we have to take up issues around equity and how they affect performance evaluation and leadership development systems. And the fourth important conversation is one around authority and accountability. And it aligns with understanding of justice in organizations. How is power attained? How is power exercised within organizations? And these 4 pathways align with the various stages of one's career within the organization. So the access conversation speaks to what happens at the point of entry. Authority and accountability speaks to what happens for those Black professionals who do attain leadership positions, even at the most senior levels, and still have to navigate the complex dynamics of race. So I'll walk through each of these 4, giving some examples, and then offer some action items to address these 4 sets of issues. So the first issue, or the first barrier, as I mentioned, was around access. We know access is an issue because we look at the statistics when we compare 13% of the population of which is comprised by African American or Black Americans, according to the US Census. And then we compare that 13% to the 8% of Blacks who are in managerial positions across industries and sectors. We already see that there's underrepresentation. When we go to the more senior levels of leadership, just 3.8% of CEOs, 1.4% of managing directors at finance companies, 1.8% of partners at US law firms, and also less than 2% of board members, corporate board members, are Black. So there's underrepresentation. What are the root causes of this underrepresentation? Our research speaks to lack of access at many critical junctures. So lack of access to education, healthcare, housing, financial capital, and even professional networks, all of which are essential for building resources and having healthy lives, while also building resources. And by the healthy lives component, I'm also speaking to what we've seen this summer about the disproportionate access to quality healthcare and the adverse impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities in the United States in particular. 75% of the children who have died from COVID or suffered from COVID are Black and Latinx children. And we know that the death rates are disproportionately higher for Black adults than for other adults, white adults in particular, with COVID-19. So we've been talking a lot about these conversations of access in society, but what are the implications for our own organizations? We see the data around underrepresentation and lack of access, but we've talked about beyond the health implications of COVID, we also talked about the adverse economic implications of COVID-19. So Black small business owners being adversely affected, Black workers who are quote unquote essential workers, and even expanding beyond Black workers, women of color as essential workers, especially in healthcare systems, operating 50% of those frontline roles for patient care, even though they're significantly underrepresented as physicians and healthcare administrators. So the statistics do tell a story, but as Maxine Williams reminds us, they only tell part of the story. They don't capture what it feels like to be the only Black or Hispanic team member, or the effect of this kind of marginalization on employees in the group as a whole. So the next three barriers speak more to the experience, the qualitative and subjective experience of being a Black member of an organization who is statistically and historically underrepresented in positions of power. So the second barrier is around authenticity. We hear voices from Black professionals that communicate all of the ways they struggle to bring their authentic selves to work, to express their ideas, to express their identities. And both of those are challenging and cause harm to the individual and to the organization when they're suppressed. So, for instance, one academic that we interviewed in one of the studies wrote, "I simultaneously feel invisible as an African-American woman in institutions and hypervisible in the same institutions because I am outspoken." How can one be invisible and hypervisible at the same time? This is curious conundrum, isn't it? So for African-American professionals, they talk about what they feel is scrutiny or overemphasis around racial stereotypes and flaws. But on the flip side, what feels invisible are their contributions. What are their strengths, their talents, their accomplishments, and also all the identity work that they're doing behind the scenes to try to signify that they can fit into the organization. For instance, Patricia Hewlin and Anna Marie Brooms published a chapter in our book around facades of conformity. Now, facades of conformity are used by employees of all backgrounds when they are pretending that they endorse the values of the organization, suppressing their dissent, really just trying to go along or toe the party line, so to speak, and not deviate or show out in any way that would cause attention to them and cause people to question their fidelity or loyalty to the team or the organization. But they found that people who identify as a minority in a number of ways, like all of the different identities that you all checked, if you felt that you were a minority or underrepresented along any of those meaningful or valued identities at work, you would be more likely to wear a facade of conformity. They also looked across racial groups and found that Black and African American professionals were most likely to wear facades of conformity. So that's one data point. There's other data that supports less psychological safety at work, feeling less connected at work, less connected to coworkers, less connected to one's authentic self, and less connected to meaningful tasks and high impact work opportunities. And all of this translates into lower levels of overall satisfaction, lower intent to stay at the current employer, and fewer high quality connections at work. Those high quality connections at work become particularly problematic, or the lack of high quality connections at work becomes particularly problematic when we're considering advancement. So often our diversity statistics, if shown firm-wide, would inflate the appearance of representation because people of color are overrepresented at the lowest levels of the organization and underrepresented at the very top levels of the organization. There's an advancement barrier at play as well. And this advancement barrier is reinforced by the lack of high quality connections, as mentioned before, but also some flaws in our performance evaluation systems and our leadership development processes. Black professionals report having fewer perceived opportunities to learn and to grow at work. They self-report feeling that their role is less significant or less important for the mission and the purpose of the company. They have less access to the developmental relationships that help people to grow, advance, get the high quality feedback that they need to be able to continue to leverage their strengths and develop in their areas of weakness. So less access to those sponsors and mentors. And then the sponsors who advocate for them to advance and to be designated for more high impact jobs and positions within the organization. Ironically here, you'll see in the quote featured on this slide, instead of having sponsors who mentor and advocate for them when they're not in the room, they report being actively discouraged for trying to grow and develop and advance in their careers. There's data from the Center for Talent Innovation that supports that Black women, and McKinsey as well, that Black women have a strong interest in taking on leadership positions. They do, in fact, lean in far more than many of their counterparts, but they're actively being discouraged from doing so. So one professional in one of the studies that we published, this study was actually based in a New England city, and we were looking at healthcare professionals who most of them had very elite educational backgrounds, but were experiencing a ceiling or a wall and trying to reach higher level administrative positions. Don't worry about moving forward, they said. You're too ambitious. And so she wondered, yeah, those are the same traits I see in my white colleagues, but I never hear them being called ambitious, certainly not in a way that would be an insult. And then they also find that they're investing a lot of time and energy on diversity related activities. And their assessment is that these are not going to be value add when it's time to consider the potential leaders for the next level in the organization. In fact, one finance executive in a study by the Robert Twigo Foundation stated that diversity recruiting activities can be the kiss of death. Yes, it's important, but those events are not on your boss's radar. And there's even more sobering data that suggests that when people of color and women champion diversity initiatives, that their performance evaluation can suffer. So it's risky to try to take on those kinds of leadership roles, but often those are the only pathways to having greater influence in the organization that many Black professionals see. The fourth barrier, as I mentioned earlier, relates to the experience that Black professionals have when they reach that coveted leadership position. There's a study that documents the positive contributions that Black leaders make, published by Keisha Thomas and her colleagues. They talk about how Black leaders are important because they help to expand and redefine in positive ways some of the norms or expectations of leadership. Who is the prototype? Who can lead? How should people lead? Having more diverse leaders helps us to expand that understanding in some healthy and productive ways. Black leaders engage in a lot of mentoring, a lot of service activities, both inside of their organizations and within their communities. They engage very heavily in philanthropic efforts and activities as well, and they do tend to champion diversity, even though they know it comes at a cost. But while they're doing this, they're also facing some ongoing resistance to the very act of leading within their organization. So there's a complicated power dynamics that align with the leadership profile, or what people typically expect to see when they're identifying a leader within an organization or an industry, or even within most communities. The typical prototype of high power, high status leaders does not align with the Black professionals' racial category. So because of that, they're often associated with occupations that align with places that Black and brown workers usually show up when organizations. So if they're a physician, they're often mistaken for an orderly or the physician's assistant. If they come into round with one of their residents or interns, people will address the resident and intern as if they're the physician rather than the Black physician, regardless of their age and amount of experience. This also happens with consulting teams when they're going out to meet with clients and they aren't recognized as the consulting team, but are assumed to be out of place or questioned about their whereabouts, where they're going. These are all legitimacy challenges. They're very subtle, but they happen over and over and over again. So they have a cumulative effect that undermines people's ability to construct and sustain those positive identities at work that we talked about were so important. So if you identify strongly with your profession or with your occupation, and then you continue to have these legitimacy challenges on a day-to-day basis, it can be psychologically and physiologically damaging. Also, Ashley Rosette at Duke Fuqua School has conducted a stream of studies that show how non-prototypical leaders are judged more harshly for their failures, and they're rewarded less generously for their successes. So for instance, she and her colleagues conducted an archival analysis of quarterbacks and how they were covered in media stories after winning or losing football games. And Black quarterbacks were judged more harshly, or at least written about and characterized in more negative terms when their teams lost. When their teams won, the article focused less on the skill of the quarterback and more so on the great things the team had done. Well, this becomes even more interesting because when white quarterbacks are the subject of study, that trend is reversed. The winning quarterbacks get a lot of attention within the articles and positive visibility within these articles. But when they lose, there are more external attributions that are offered. So that's one striking example that we can all probably relate to think about how we create some narratives around success and failure and the extent to which we raise the bar or lower the bar based on someone's racial categories. The last important insight from our book around this topic of authority and accountability relates to the kinds of leadership roles that Black professionals tend to take on. They tend to take on high stakes glass cliff roles to lead organizations through sustained crises. This chapter was contributed by Dr. Erica James, who is now the Dean of the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania, the first woman dean, the first person of color dean, and by Lynn Wooten, Dr. Lynn Wooten, who is currently the president of Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts, and was formerly a dean at Cornell. So they write about glass cliff, and as higher ed administrators, they are also leading in glass cliff environments right now in their own respects, as we know of the significant change that we're all undergoing as a result of the pandemic right now. So moving forward, what are the recommendations? And I imagine we'll take up more of this conversation around recommendations in our open Q&A. But first, let's talk about what often gets in the way of action. Okay, so as we try to respond to the racial injustice around us, we're hampered in our three zones of action. From our headspace, we're hampered by our desire to deny the relevance of race and the prominence or pervasiveness of bias in careers, organizations, society, as well as in our lives. We sort of began to get uncomfortable about the disparate experiences that people are having based on their racial categories. And so we start to try to kind of deconstruct their realities and say, well, that couldn't possibly be happening. I don't think that that's really about race at all. That must be about, a number of different factors. Or maybe they just weren't good enough. Maybe they just weren't talented enough. Maybe they're just whining. It must be a million different things, but I don't think that that's about race at all. Secondarily, we can start to get defensive in our own desire to cultivate and sustain that positive identity at work that I talked about earlier. Sometimes it doesn't work in the best purposes of positive organizing. Sometimes it means like we dig in our heels and we invest our focus, energy, and attention into trying to defend our own ego and our own self-worth or sense of self. And we construct some very complex narratives that would justify our own positions of relative status and power without acknowledging the structural patterns that exist. And so when we deny and defend, then it's pretty easy to disengage from action. We either silence, right? We just tune out. We're not talking about race at all. We don't have those conversations. They're taboo. It's too hard. It's too painful. So we just don't go there. Or we take on the stance of neutrality and we frame silence as neutrality when in fact it's not. In reality, silence is consent or an endorsement to continue to perpetuate these patterns and systems that in some respects take on a life of their own when unaddressed. So what can we do? Instead, we can engage these three zones of action to push us forward in different directions. Acknowledge the relevance of race and bias in careers, organizations, society, and in our lives. Affirm the value of diversity and Black workers' potential for growth and advancement. This is really important, to just have the belief that someone has the potential to grow and advance means that we're going to be more likely to invest the resources, to take some risks, to make some big bets on people who don't always fit the prototype at first blush, meaning they might not remind us of our younger selves because we may not share the value, a lot of the valued identities on the surface, like race, gender, some of the other things that I listed, but there are many other identities that we could in fact share and find points of connection so that we can affirm that value of diversity and invest in the growth and advancement of Black workers and other workers and organizations. So with our hands, then we engage in action that supports Black workers in ways that will directly and indirectly benefit them. It creates a broader climate for diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. And that would allow everyone to thrive within the organization. So a rising tide lifts all boats, and that's part of the concept around these actions. So I'll give some examples of what these actions could look like. But the first is really just a change in mindset. And this is an affirmation that I think is really important for us to take up and to process so that we can get unstuck in doing this work. Acknowledging the presence of bias and affirming the value of difference will not diminish the worth of my contributions or the validity of my hardships. It is not an either or. There are not singular truths here. And Oppression Olympics is not going to benefit us as we try to deal with the very complex and intersecting challenges of race, class, and other dimensions of difference and marginalization in our organizations. So I would like to take one more poll here to see what are some of the things you've been doing. So many of you talked about the frequency with which you've been engaging in race and race-related discussions in your companies over the summer. But what are some of the things that you all have been focusing on? Have you been doing town halls, fireside chats? Have there been strategic planning retreats? Ask Me Anything forums, been very popular, I know. Workshops, trainings, other learning opportunities. Just check all that apply. Small groups, discussions, like a facilitated listening circle, conversation circles, book clubs, those kinds of things. Maybe they've been facilitated by somebody in the organization. Maybe they were informal. Did you engage in a discussion board chat, using Slack or a channel, some other channels, or is there anything else? Let's see our results. That's from that quick tally. What's most popular? Okay, so some workshops, trainings, and other learning opportunities. And there are often questions about how to structure those in the most impactful ways. So there's, often a range of experiences around the workshops, trainings, and other learning opportunities. But interesting to see that over 60% of you have participated in that. You've been having a lot of small group discussions, and that's really important because that's where a lot of value comes from, being able to see and understand other people's stories and perspectives in a more intimate way. About half of you had a town hall with senior executives. Having leadership is really important. And I'm glad that there's about 50% of the town hall and compared to the 12% with the Ask Me Anything for Black and Brown employees, because while it is valuable and helpful to hear from employees around their experiences, it sends a very different message when senior executives are willing to sit down and, not sort of present themselves as though they have all the answers, but as someone who is engaged and committed to lifelong learning from a sense of purpose. And then about a third of you have been bringing in subject matter speakers and guest experts. Okay, thank you for sharing. Here are some other things that one might do. I mean, those were all what I documented based on the host of requests and activities that have come through since June 1, 2020 until today. But there's a whole range of things that we could and should do in order to move our system. So even if we've engaged in one or two or more of those activities, the critical step for us in moving beyond inclusion is to raise the question, what more can I do? The minute we say, oh, okay, I did this, I checked the box, I'm good, then we're sort of engaging in, or we're disengaging in a way that helps us to stay within our comfort zone. So we must ask ourselves, what more can I do? At the level of the individual. Am I activating my best self? Am I being open? Am I embracing growth in this domain and trying to build a stronger sense of self so that I can understand and appreciate what others have to offer? I can learn from and across difference. It's very hard to do that if I have an insecure or fragile sense of self. Then I can move from there when I have managerial responsibility or even as a team player to be more cognizant of the equity within systems, how resources are allocated, how performance is evaluated, how hiring decisions are made. All of those are consequential choices, and we can support more equity through the choices that we make in the process we invest, or we can undermine that. You may be in a position of leadership right now. I know many of you are. And so you're dealing with a set of questions around organizational change and how you transform the culture, the policies and practices within your organization. and to do that in a way that ensures that you're aligning with your business strategy and you're also aligning with the core values of the organization. And then as we all looked at many of the horrors, the violence and the deaths of Black and Brown people, such as George Floyd, such as Breonna Taylor, we all raise questions of what we can do to transform society using our platform, using our resources, using the collaboration and the positive organizing within our own workplaces to help to build and co-create a better world. And there are lots of other issues that call us to work as agents on behalf of transforming society. Racial justice is certainly one. But in order to continue to move through this process, we have to be clear about why we're invested in this work. Why does this matter for me? What's my why? And am I holding myself accountable? Are we holding ourselves accountable to whatever goals that we set? Or are we just sort of putting this out there in an aspirational way without truly holding ourselves accountable for meeting the commitments that we've espoused or violating the beliefs that we put forth? This is just a summary of things that leaders could ask themselves in particular, because I wanted to just double click on that a bit. If you were to walk through the questions from a leadership standpoint, once again, you would say, is diversity a nice to have or is it a must have? If it's a must have, then it will align with your leadership framework. So you would say an effective leader in our organization is one who promotes inclusion, equity, justice, diversity. You would understand how these kinds of actions do help to strengthen your strategic capabilities. So it's essential because it helps you with the operation and execution of everything that you're trying to accomplish within your organization, or with some key areas within your organization, not everything, but at least in some key areas that are consequential for you strategically. Should also have clarity about how these action items would strengthen your moral integrity and be able to articulate the costs of inattention and inaction. You know, why is silence not enough? How do they undermine our strategic and values alignment? And then the final question, do our investments align with our aspirations? So when it comes to diversity initiatives, we often want maximum return with minimal investment. And it requires the same kind of attention and investment that any other strategic imperative requires within an organization. That means putting the leadership in place and making sure that they have the necessary resources to really do the work of organizational change. So, summary, a few things that champions can do. You can move from mentor to sponsor, being that advocate. You can, in career advancement and development, you can also be advocates in matters of racial justice, championing some of these diversity initiatives. Not just for instrumental purposes because there's a business case, but also because there's a moral argument to be made and you feel convicted to be able to lead along those grounds as well. And being proactive in engaging with your external stakeholders, be it through a brand audit, working with your suppliers, thinking about pipeline initiatives, where are your investors, or how are you investing? Are you engaging in philanthropy with partnerships that will help to address many of the issues that were raised today? How do you think about occupational segregation and wage inequality within your own organization? Those are for the zone of champions. Any leader, though, designated as champion or not, any leader in this moment in time should and could think about how to create a culture of inquiry around race. Pursuing strategic and values alignment with stakeholders is always critical. What does race have to do with that for you? And then again, the questions around organizational change, holding people accountable, assessing your climate for diversity and inclusion, setting tangible goals to those who contribute to these efforts and recognizing them for such. Abandon the all one size fits all approach to diversity. The issues and challenges that we face here some of them that they articulated do apply to other groups, and I try to use the language accordingly when they do, but some of them are unique in particular to the Black experience, and therefore they have to be addressed within that vein also. Managers just focusing on equity and inclusion, again, is so important. Embracing conversations about race and identities in psychologically safe environments. Providing consistent and candid developmental feedback. Most managers avoid doing this. They hate doing this. They even hate doing positive feedback. That's one of my areas of research, is how do you help people become their best selves? You have to give them positive feedback. We hesitate to do that. That becomes even more problematic in these environments. Seeking out talented employees who don't fit the prototype, bet on their potential, and then reward those extra leadership or citizenship behaviors that Black professionals take on. And then finally, as any individual, just be open to learning. What kind of biases do we have? What kind of belief systems have we promulgated that have led us to stay in our comfort zone, in denying, defending, disengaging? Learn more about your company practices. Try to learn more about these issues of race and racial justice in particular, and then examine your opportunities to be a courageous advocate and ally within this space, knowing that you'll have to make yourself a little bit more vulnerable to do this work. You'll also have to take action in doing this work to call out racial justice, to call out racial injustices and inequities that are showing up within your organizations. So I will now open it up for a Q&A.
Laura, thank you so much for that great presentation. We really appreciate it. I've noticed a question.
Can you stop my screen share for me?
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Thank you.
There we go. So we have some questions come in through the Q&A feature, so I will read them off to you, and attendees, please feel free to continue submitting questions through the Q&A feature. So Laura, the first question we have, how can one determine whether he or she is operating in the space of intentionally inclusive versus actively anti-racist?
Yeah, so it's in some ways it's an individual question, and it's also an organizational question. So if the one is an individual question, how do I know if I'm going beyond intentionally inclusive to actively anti-racist? Well, one thing I'm doing is saying, what more can I do? Because if I'm intentionally active racist, I'm anti-racist, I'm always trying to know, what else can I do? I know these problems are deep and wide, and there's such a long history. I know there's a lot more that can be done, and so you just commit to that lifelong process of trying to promote equity and justice along these lines, knowing that you're working often against a system that you know, has just been entrenched and reinforced in many ways. I think that's one of the most important things. It's also a show of humility, and like I said, humble inquiry, not self-castigation per se, but just humble inquiry. What more do I need to learn? What more can I do? The intentionally inclusive, let me just tell you a little bit about where that can go sideways and actually work at cross purposes from what we're trying to attain here in terms of valuing difference around race. I mentioned that one size fits all diversity initiatives. We found in race work and leadership that this was one of the greatest hindrances to promoting more equity, inclusion, and justice for Black professionals. That when we really experience this shift to intentionally inclusive initiatives, we created such a big tent in our conversations around inclusion that we erased race from the scenario. Race makes us uncomfortable. It's a touch point. It's a pain point for many people in many organizations. And so we avoided talking explicitly about race as an example of exclusion and marginalization, and focused on how everybody could bring their whole selves to work. There's some value in that. I've published substantially on topics of authenticity and bringing one's whole self to work. But having those conversations without putting on the table some of the structural inequalities create real challenges. So over the summer, there's like one example that I use from from IBM and how some of their messaging has changed over the summer for an org example. So IBM has a very prominent campaign, #InclusiveIBM, over the past couple of years. That includes language such as "we welcome all races and ethnicities, all religions, all countries of origin, all gender identities, all sexual orientations, all abilities and disabilities, all spoken language, all ages, everyone. We stand here with you. You are safe here." Those are valuable lessons and messages, and they are important. Once Asian Americans were attacked in the spring, because of the coronavirus, we saw hate crimes increasing against Asian Americans. They put forth a public statement that included this language. It started with, "At IBM, diversity and inclusion are among our highest values and have been for over 100 years, which is why we strongly oppose discrimination in all its forms." And then they went farther in the statement to say, "We stand against the stigmatization of the Asian community resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we call on all people everywhere to denounce harassment and hostility against the Asian community. It is imperative for their dignity, personal safety, and security." So you can see that shift in the messaging for IBM. And then in June, they launched their Embrace campaign, and they have an associated pledge along with that. "I pledge not to remain silent. I pledge to better understand the Black experience. I pledge to fully embrace race and ethnicity with empathy. I pledge to demonstrate equality through action. I pledge to create safe spaces to speak out. I pledge to be an upstander in every environment. I pledge to be an ally." So you see that it's a shift in the emphasis and the intention that helps to move more into the zone. It's not about getting a badge or checking a box of virtuosity.
Thank you, Laura. Next question. Allyship is a hot topic right now.
It is.
How is this truly achieved? How do you take a dormant relationship into allyship if you're in the majority? And what are the actions?
Yeah. So colleague Sarah Kaplan and Sarah is at University of Toronto Rotman. She and I published an op-ed in Bloomberg just today on this topic about allyship. And we said that there are two important components of allyship. And one is that allies have to be prepared to step aside. And allyship also involves being prepared to step in front. So it's not just, being on the sidelines to cheer somebody else on while they're fighting the fight. It's like really getting in it on the front line, engaging in some of these tough conversations about race, trying to raise awareness of different patterns of inequality that are taking place within the organization, with the understanding and expectation that you're going to experience some resistance to that conversation. It also means sort of recognizing some of the tension between inclusion and equity. See, we love the idea of inclusion when it means everyone is welcome, as in there's room for everyone in this great big tent. Just pull up a chair and you can fit at the table too. That presumes that there's an ever expanding table. But in many organizations, they're pyramids, right? So when it gets to senior leadership positions, coveted leadership roles and responsibilities, or even high potential leadership programs, they become more and more and more selective. So there is a certain point at which, if we want the representation to change at senior levels, that everybody has to be willing to allow that shift to take place, which means that there will be a change in the representation of whom we saw taking up those roles and people stepping aside. We use the example of Alexis Ohanian giving up his seat on the board of Reddit, with the commitment that that seat would be filled by a Black person for for that company, and that was his own company. But that was an example of him saying, look, if I really say I stand for this, then I have to model, I have to walk the talk. I have to walk the talk.
Thank you, Laura. Next question. How do you manage up on this topic if your leadership has outdated views on diversity and inclusion? Is pushing change upward even possible?
Yes, it is. I saw someone just ask for the link to the Bloomberg piece, so I'm going to drop that in the chat. You all know I'm a professor, so I can actually read the chat and talk at the same time. I have another article as well. I'll just drop the link in the chat in response to that question. So Jim Dietert and I, he's one of my colleagues at Darden. We published an article in Harvard Business Review in July, how to call out racial injustice at work. And in that article, we talked about some of the things that you can do to help to increase the likelihood that you would be effective. There are, of course, no guarantees, and there is a lot of resistance. If there weren't, we wouldn't be having this conversation, about like how to strategize to do this. But we talked about using allies and speaking as a collective. So if you can find some like-minded issues and raise the issue together, then people are less likely to attribute it to some sour grapes that you might have personally about your own experiences. We talked about the self-regulation, about choosing the time and the space and the moment, making sure that you have the safe spaces to channel your emotions about things. Don't suppress them, but as you're coming in to have these conversations, you want to be able to do it in a way when you're feeling more grounded and calm about what's going on. We want you to frame what you say in ways that's compelling to your counterpart. So you've got to understand what resonates with your boss or with people in more senior levels in the organizations. When you use some language about a commitment to making progress, that can help to signify that you think they could be on board with this work, and that's like a gratuitous act within a conversation that can help to open things up rather than coming in and saying you're not doing X, Y, Z, because that was going to throw them back into the defensive stance. And then when you have these conversations, and we provide more detail, but when you have these conversations, also be prepared to follow up. So they're going to bring out some hard truths. It takes a lot of courage, and we usually don't want to have these conversations extend for a long period of time. But if you continue to have the conversation as a thread, as some form of a thread, then you can have the opportunity to just circle back, and say, hey, I know that was a tough one, or do you have any other questions for me after we had that initial conversation? Just giving it an opportunity to really develop and unfold over time.
Thank you, Laura. We have a few more questions.
Okay.
In the box. How can we learn to be patient through an internal evolution? Creating the pipeline, enhancing our internal evaluation structure, vetting our hiring practices, studying policy and demographics takes time and has the benefit of a lot of inclusion opportunities, but it sometimes feels like we just have to flip a switch.
So we always have to flip a switch. It's just which switch are we going to flip? Start somewhere, start with experiments, try something, document what happens, get some feedback about what happened well and what didn't happen well. I mean, it's so interesting. Even for organizations that embrace innovation, when it comes to this kind of work, we tend to be averse to that. We tend to be much more conservative and risk averse. But what's really required is to do two things. One, engage some subject matter experts, some consultancy, but then design some experiments, some opportunities to learn from your organization and see what would and could work. What I have found with organizations is that 9 times out of 10, the answers already exist within the organization. The solutions are there. People can tell you some of the things that you can do to help address many of the issues that I raised around engagement and experiences of connection at work. Those are things that anybody should and could be able to start with on a daily basis. As far as the representation switch is concerned, I see representation as a starting point and an ending point for systemic change. So yes, there is a moment where you flip the switch, and if you say, gosh, we don't have enough Black leaders in our organization, okay, put out the word that you're looking to hire more Black leaders in your organization. I guarantee you will find a plethora of talent who would be interested and enthusiastic to come into the organization. Now, once they come in, they also need to have the bandwidth to help you change the culture so that it is more affirming and more welcoming for other people like them to come in the organization. If the presumption is like, we welcome you to come and join us and do everything exactly the way we do it, just follow the house rules, then you're going to run into some problems and challenges. But if you start to welcome more people in and expect that the organization will change as new voices and perspectives come in, then that could benefit, again, the organization as a whole and make it more attractive to the best talent of all backgrounds.
Thank you, Laura. Next question. Do you have any tips for getting through to white people who are instinctively defensive and interpret these conversations as an attack? I've seen this defensiveness to be especially strong with those who have faced their own adversities in the past and do not see themselves as privileged.
Well, I mean, that level of defensiveness is it's deeply rooted, and we have seen it in very pronounced ways, even in the past month. I mean, there are public outcries against having conversations, learning conversations, workshops, training, so forth, that even speak to issues of systemic racism and what has happened over generations. So, I think it would be disingenuous for me to minimize the extent of the defensiveness, just how deeply it can run and how damaging it can be. And that's why I did offer the affirming framework instead of deny, defend, disengage, to try to help people to acknowledge, affirm, and act. I'll just put in the quote again, the mindset that I think is essential for helping to unroot that sense of defensiveness. See, the defensiveness comes from a sense of insecurity when people are concerned and questioning whether or not they are in fact good enough. Are you saying I'm a good person? Are you saying I'm a bad person? Are you saying that I don't deserve the things I have? Are you saying that means that I haven't worked hard? Does that mean that I'm not qualified, all of those interpretations can feed into the sense of denial and disengagement. So reassuring people that it clearly many people have worked hard to get what they have. But everybody didn't travel the same road to get there. That's the level of understanding that is helpful to engage. Sharing personal stories can be a powerful way to connect. It can create some breakthrough moments in some circumstances. But there are others who are just not interested and not willing, and they've decided to tune out. And it's like, when you decided to tune out and somebody keeps blasting the radio station from the other room, like, you're not going to listen to it. You don't like that channel. You decided not to hear that channel. And so, it's just not going to be palatable to you. So you keep blasting the volume, it's only going to make them sort of hate the music more. I have found that there are far more people who are genuinely concerned and really want to, especially at this moment, acknowledge, affirm, and act. And so I think our energy is best spent by trying to connect with and engage with the people who are already open to doing the work and would like to know more about what they can do. And I'm just one of those people who believes that there are still far more of those individuals than there are the ones who are deeply resistant. And so our energy and our efforts are best spent on trying to help them to deepen their understanding and channel their good intentions in ways that can help us to create a better society.
Thank you, Laura. How do you ensure D&I stays front and center? It seems we're approaching the stage where people are growing impatient and resentful with the continued requirements and responsibilities required of D&I and anti-racism.
Yeah, we are. It's a pretty short attention span, but that's nothing new. I mean, that's why the conversation keeps reinventing itself every 10 years. I mean, you had in the 70s, the equal opportunity. And then in the 80s, it was more of an emphasis on affirmative action. When that started to lose its appeal, then the industry started to emphasize globalization and also the Workforce 2000 and then Workforce 2020, the projections about new entrants to the workforce being majority minority in the 21st century, just saying, look, the world is changing, the demographics are changing, so we have to be able to engage in diversity in different ways. And that was the birth or the zenith of the business case for diversity. And then when that started to waver a bit, then we started to move into conversations about inclusion and belonging and say, well, we understand representation only gets you so far. So now let's start focusing on the inclusion and belonging conversations. And so again, like, they continue to morph and evolve because our attention span around this work is relatively short. We consider it a nice to have, but not a must have. So that the questions that I posed for leaders are questions that I think are essential to drive the sustained focus and energy in this work. Those questions were, how do these actions align with our leadership framework? How do they strengthen our strategic capabilities? How do they strengthen our moral integrity? What are the costs of our inattention and inaction? If we turn away in this moment, how could that hurt us? Citi just released a report of, let me give you the number, yeah, so racism has cost the US economy $16 trillion. I mean, we've got to have those kinds of conversations remaining prominent as well, so that people don't feel that that neutrality is a palatable choice in this moment. Um, but you know, ultimately, I think it's just going to take courageous leadership and sustained investment of resources. It'll take the conviction, the moral conviction of people um, who have power and status to listen to the voices of those on the margins and continue. 16 trillion. This was a report by Citi. But to really listen to the voices of those on the margins. So let's be clear here. We are where we are right now because people were protesting in the streets. People were lifting their voices on social media. These Black Lives Matter statements and all of the different events that unfolded did not come out of the ether. They did not come because the CEO compact, you know, as admirable as Tim Ryan was to launch that after the Ferguson protests a few years ago, you know, they didn't drive the widespread corporate leadership and statements that Black Lives Matter this summer. You know, those are responses to what was happening from grassroots organizing in the streets and the voices of consumers as stakeholders speaking out against brands that they felt were not reflecting the principles in society, calling into question organizations whose leaders said that they promote racial justice and inclusion, but the demographics did not align with those public statements. Is bottom up. There's a lot of bottom up mobilization around change, and that's what has often happened. So, you know, the sustained focus comes really from that productive tension between what society calls for organizations to do and what courageous leaders choose to do to serve and meet the needs of their stakeholders.
Thank you, Laura. Can you give us a little more information on that report by Citi?
More on the report by Citi. Hold on, because it's not my report. So that means I'm gonna pull up my cheat sheet. So it was, let's see. I got the link. I turned off my my Wi-Fi so that I wouldn't have any interruptions on the call. But I got the link, and it's saying this was a new study from Citigroup. Since 2000, the U.S. GDP has lost $16 trillion as a result of anti-Black discrimination, and they calculated that based on 4 key racial gaps for Black Americans, so wages, education, housing, and investment. And they projected that if those gaps had been closed 20 years ago, $16 trillion could have been added to the US economy. Then they forecast that if those gaps are closed today, $5 trillion could be added to the US GDP over the next 5 years, according to the analysis. So that, that's one of the few studies that begins to quantify the damage that has been done by the lack of emphasis on this work. Even over the past 20 years, when you think about that time frame, what have we been doing in our organizations? What have we emphasized in these domains over the past 20 years? And, how could we have benefited from making a different set of choices? I think that has been a missing link in the puzzle, and it's one really worth evaluating. When I wrote an op-ed for Bloomberg this summer, critiquing the business case for diversity on these grounds, and suggested that perhaps we also start documenting or require people to document the business case for bias. You know, why do we presume that bias is the most profitable or sustainable pathway, and then have to counter argue that or come up with enough evidence to suggest or to support our investments in diversity and inclusion work. We need to document the costs of not doing this work, and then require people who are choosing not to do this work to justify that choice, instead of always having to be on the defense. Thank you, Amber, for putting the link. Always having to be on the defense in doing this work.
Thank you, Laura. We have just over 5 minutes left. Let's get another question or two in before we send it back to Jack to close us out.
Okay.
Next question. Is there one aspect of diversity and inclusion work that you believe is most commonly misunderstood among leaders? Is there one big thing that people tend to get wrong?
Yeah, I think the one big thing that people tend to get wrong is we can't find any. Why isn't your organization more diverse? Why don't you have more Black professionals or Black people that working in different places in your organization beyond the janitorial team or the food service prep? Well, we can't find any. And then people just shake their heads and walk away as if that's it, instead of interrogating, you know, how are we sourcing talent? To what extent are we relying on our own networks, which are largely homogenous, particularly around race, and overrepresentative of people who are like us, who are more similar to us? Like, are we really thinking about how to source talent in more diverse ways? And then are we examining the ways that our biases impact screening processes and selection processes? You know, are we really hiring based upon the stated competencies, or is there a noise in our system that leads us to do what others have done in the research, which is to discount people who have ethnic or Black sounding names, to rate resumes less favorably when they show that somebody is engaged in some diversity or racial activities and events? Everything else on the resume could be exactly the same, but if there's a signal about your race through your name or your volunteer activities or something like that, you'll be rated less favorably for that. If you have more elitist hobbies listed on your resume, it'll be rated higher, whether or not you know, skiing or lacrosse has anything to do with the job at all. There's noise in our data and our selection systems. And then there's also a willingness to shift the standards or bend the rules in the midst of hiring processes. So we will come up with a rationale for bringing in somebody who has less qualifications, but a lot of potential. And, you know, weight that differently based upon the demographic characteristics of the candidate. So I think we focus so much on the question of representation in the pipeline, and then we find ourselves into the trap of we can't find any. And the most prominent example of that was Wells Fargo CEO making a statement of that sort in the past week and receiving a flurry of criticisms along those lines for using that as what he thought was a statement of fact.
Thank you, Laura. We really appreciate your time. We're coming up on 11:30 and there's still questions in the chat box, but we'll save those for another time. I'm going to turn it back over to Jack to close us out for the event. Thank you again.
Great, thanks. Laura, that was a great conversation, and thank you for spending your time with us today and sharing your valuable insights. There were some side conversations going on in the chat room, so I know your presentation really resonated with a lot of people, so that was great. Our region is highly diverse and it boasts some really incredible resources, yet we also continue to face significant gaps here in racial, economic, and social equity. These gaps aren't sustainable, and in fact, they're holding us back. So we need to think about how we close those. There's much to be done at the Board of Trade. We continue to listen, learn, work with our members and partners across the region to figure out some long-term solutions. Because this is a long-term effort. This isn't going to happen overnight or in the next few weeks or months, but we have to stay with it. So Laura, thank you again for sharing your thoughts with us today. And Terry, thank you and TD Bank. This was another memorable Morningstar speaker event, and it wouldn't be possible without you all. And so with that, we'll wrap up. Everyone take care and have a great day. See you soon.